Let's bust some more Victorian clothing myths. Hi everyone, my name is Caitlin. On this channel I teach old-fashioned sewing skills and we make reproduction clothing. We have been working through a series of just me telling you about some myths I have seen pop up around my beloved 19th century, and we've been debunking them slowly but surely, and today we're going to do that again. Let's go ahead and get to the myths. We are going to discuss 3 myths today that somehow revolve around being poor and what poor people wore. And just so you know where we're going with this, we're going to also focus mostly on the mid-19th century because this is where a lot of those myths prevail, mostly in the American Civil War era, so like the 1860s-ish, and then a little bit before and a little bit after. We'll discuss a little bit of that. And so our first myth is going to be the myth of mismatched skirts and blouses, and what most people do wrong with that outfit, because there is technically a way to do that outfit correctly. The second myth will be about using solid colored cottons in making 19th century clothing, and the third myth will be discussing homespun fabric and how it specifically relates to modern homespun and the differences thereof. So again, all 3 of the myths today are kind of around misconceptions of looking poor in the 19th century. So our first myth is going to be about mismatched skirts and blouses, especially in the 1860s. I see this done a lot in the American Civil War reenacting eras. And this is a hard one because anyone can come up with a photograph and say, see, it happened, without actually understanding context, and context is everything. I did a video last month about researching the types of researchers and where I find my research documents. So we talked in length about the type of person who just shoves documentation in your face without any context and just says, see, it happened, without understanding really anything behind that photograph other than it's what they wanted to see, which is the white blouse and the patterned skirt. So the problem is with this outfit in particular, it is a very high fashion ensemble and is not a working woman's outfit whatsoever. A working woman's outfit 99% of the time in America is going to be a one-piece dress of cotton or wool. The whole blouse with the colored cotton skirt thing is a reenactorism, as it is known, and wearing that as a poor or a working class garment is very incorrect for the mid-19th century, especially American Civil War time period. And that's where we see it being worn by living historians or reenactors. It should never be worn within any type of living history setting, so any type of historical setting whatsoever, that mismatched blouse and skirt, especially with the white top. That's just not what happened. A white baggy shirt with a cotton skirt is not how you achieve an 1860s look. This whole process of finding original proof, quote unquote, and then parading it around without digging and finding out the context of the piece is what I call surface level research. And in my little self-made imaginary levels of research that I came up with myself that I'm very proud of, it is under lackadaisical researcher, because those are people who don't really try to do their research. They just want to find their proof and then they parade it around like they found something special. It's not even real research, because real research includes the context, which again is everything. If you don't understand the context, then you don't understand that sliver of information that you found at all. What context are we missing from, say, this photograph here? Well, let's see. We can see that she appears to be wearing a white top with a dark skirt. We can see an approximate age. We can tell that she's a she. We can tell her race, but we cannot see her social economic status, her livelihood, her degree of fashionability, what she's doing on that day, why she chose this outfit, what is she going to do in that outfit, exactly who she is, whether she's married or not, what the fiber content of this outfit is. We can make a guess, and even an educated guess, about most of those things, but they're all still just guesses. They're not research. They're not fact. And all those things do go into what someone chooses to wear and how they choose to wear it. You change one of those things and the entire story changes. And so photographs, yes, are excellent tools of research, but they should not be used alone. And they are not documentation unless you have the context behind them. Further research tools in this particular case would be things like ladies' magazines or fashion magazines, diaries, probates or wardrobe lists, shopkeepers' records, dressmaker manuals, and extant or original garments. So let us first begin looking at the context of these types of mismatched outfits by first looking at period photographs with a certain amount of context, as much as we can glean from them, and then we'll go through the original garments in ladies' magazines for further context. So notice how all of these white tops with color skirts are all in a studio setting. They are not occupation photographs. The sitters are not doing anything other than posing. And that is context that tells us something. It tells us what type of outfit this is. We see a lot of different ways to wear this mismatched look with a matching corselet, not a corset, a corselet, what is now called a Swiss weight or a Medici belt, a plain belt, etc. Lots of options. They are all well dressed. They are all in hoops. They have fashionable hair and accessories. Now let's look at some occupational photographs, or mid-19th century people in the wild, as I like to call it. This is a scullery maid in the 1870s, an 1870s housewife, 1870s maids, basket weaver from the early 1860s, but the woman does appear to be visiting the basket weaver because she does have her outerwear and her bonnet still on, which suggests to me that she's visiting. A sweeper of some sort from the 1860s, an 1850s seamstress, another 1850s seamstress, an 1854 seamstress that was either Mexican or Spanish, I forget the exact reference to that, an 1802 or 1863 housewife taken by her husband, some 1860s seamstresses. This is a Godey's work dress from 1859. This is English of Mrs. Cameron and her staff, and you can tell Mrs. Cameron because she has that fancy lace shawl on it. I forget the name of this one, but this we have a lady with a skirt and a jacket over top. That was a bit tricky because it looks mismatched, but it's not. It's a jacket. We have an 1860s itinerant butcher, which I did not know was a profession back then. That's kind of cool. This is 1850s. I believe it's a lady doing laundry. She has what looks to be a sack and petticoat, which is mismatched, but I will explain sack and petticoats a little bit more in the next myth. They are a form of undress similar to a wrapper. They were fancy versions as well, especially in the early 1850s, and work versions, which is what we are seeing here, and also the 1859 print from earlier. Although that one did specifically say that the top and bottom are not mismatched. They are of the same fabric. These are two 1860s maids, both matching tops and bottoms, and one even has trim on her dress. More working girls. Notice the theme of the rolled up sleeves and the slightly shorter skirts, but still fashionable one-piece dress with aprons, clean hair, sometimes hoops and sometimes not. But if no hoops, still a couple of petticoats. Here's another maid in a hoop. This is a laundress in 1866. Another point I'd like to make out is that it can be easy to think that the tops and skirts are mismatched if you're not paying close enough attention. But if you have paid attention, you'll notice that several of the women here have had their skirts pinned up, revealing their petticoats or their underskirt, which sometimes looks like a mismatched ensemble, but when it's really just a long matching skirt that's pinned up out of the way and you're seeing a petticoat or even a dress lining. Here's another lady with a broom. This time it's an older lady. Perfectly fashionable ensemble and working class to boot. And what do you know? It's almost like there was a social expectation of being within a certain degree of fashion that people, rich and poor, young and old, try to emulate. Anyway, here's a group of mill workers, and this is a photo that I often see toted around as, oh look, here's their proof of mixed matched skirts and bodices. But if you look really closely, you'll see they're just wearing aprons, and their dresses are all typical one-piece dresses. And here's some more laundresses in the wild. The one on the right is even smiling, which I appreciate. I also love how the older women kept the custom of wearing a cap. They're all still fashionable, but they do have their degree of personal flairs. Here's an 1860s laundress with a washing machine, and then another washerwoman. Again, matching dress with an apron. A sweeper again with her skirts pulled back, revealing a very nice petticoat that I can almost guarantee you is wool, which is a very practical choice for working petticoats. But she still has on a matching one-piece dress. And here are some nurses and officers in the U.S. Sanitary Commission during the Civil War. Very fashionable outfits. An artist who is wearing a typical reform or bloomer outfit is still a matching outfit. This is a fisherman's wife who's wearing a one-piece dress, nice striped petticoat, an apron, and a head covering. This one's called Taking a Break, and it's a couple having fun, but still it's a one-piece dress with an apron. And here's another one that is toted around by the They Wore Mismatched Outfits fan club, and it's just a wide apron, because if you look over to the far right, you can see her dress skirt that clearly matches her bodice. And finally, a fruit seller by the looks of it, wearing a one-piece dress, and yes, you can tell by the peak of the bodice underneath her shawl, and she's wearing an apron and a nice bonnet to boot, a really nice bonnet actually. And notice that all these women are wearing corsets, petticoats, have their hair done up. Yes, that is a very important thing we need to make sure we're noticing, and are often in hoops in the hoop era. They are generally very fashionable even while working. And that's another important thing I'm trying to get across, so that we need to remember that we look into period photography, we need to not take things at face value. Look beyond your first impression and glean as many clues as you possibly can from that photograph, especially if you don't have any other context you can grab. And recognize what context you do not have, so you don't inaccurately apply something to your situation when you don't know if that's her situation. So now that's fairly fully debunked as far as poor women wearing the mismatched outfits, but I do want to explore actual mismatched outfits and how to wear one correctly, because yes, they do exist. So first, let's discuss that this is not a blouse. It is a bodice, a body, or a waist occasionally. Mostly just a bodice or a body. Also, when we think of blouse, we do tend to think of something that is unfitted and baggy, and that is not what we're looking at here whatsoever. Even gathered bodice that aren't as fitted as a darted bodice, it's going to be very fitted at the shoulders, it's going to be fitted at the bust, and it's still going to be fitted at the waistline, even if between the bust and waist is not particularly fitted. And even on some of the gathered bodices, you'll notice on the insides that they are often darted, so they are still very fitted, which is an overlay of not as fitted, especially in the 1840s and 1850s when we see those fan front bodices. Those are often very fitted linings with a controlled chaos going on over top with the fashion fabric. And the same is true with those white bodices that we see in the 1860s. They are very fitted and structured. They are also a very fine cotton or silk, usually so sheer that if you put several layers of fabric over top of a book, you could still read the book through it. That is how sheer and fine of a fabric we're speaking. And these fabrics were often very expensive, even the cotton ones. People always think that cotton equals cheap and silk equals expensive, and that's not necessarily true. There were cheap cottons and there were expensive cottons that sometimes cost more than your cheaper silks. So there's a lot of overlap there that I don't think we're often aware of, and that is a future video of going through fabric prices within the mid-19th century. I'm aware that that is something we need to talk about. It's going to happen eventually. But here's a plainer bodice, and you can see just how sheer and fine this fabric is. This is something you're going to have a corset cover as well, or a petticoat body would be the more common mid-19th century term under these particular garments. And here's another one with a fancier top. This one is shirred, which is a lovely effect and only looks right in the finest of fabrics. This is an 1850s version of that sheer basque for summer, and most of these are unfitted at the waist, very similar to a stocking petticoat, and are held in with belts and such. So I've actually made two of these, and they are excellent for summer wear for the early 1850s. This is another sheer and very fine bodice. And finally, this one is made of net, adorned with lace and tiny little velvet ribbon. So here's a close-up. You can see how delicate this garment is. Very fine and likely pretty expensive. It would definitely be expensive today. So cotton bobinette, which is what you need to make this, would cost over $50 a yard today. And that's just cotton bobinette. Silk bobinette costs nearly $100 a yard. And with those bishop sleeves, you're looking at least 3 yards of fabric, depending on how wide your bobinette is. Could be closer to 2 if you had a very wide bobinette. And that's the stuff that you can't buy at better prices. Like, I'm pretty good at finding some really cheap period silks and wools. Bobinette is something that I can't find cheap. Like, I don't think it exists. And so that's definitely something to take into consideration if you're planning an outfit like this. Speaking of planning an outfit like this, let's look at a scenario, because yes, at first glance it does look like it's cheaper to do the mismatched outfits as a reenactor or as a costume. So let's give a little bit of context of what it takes to create these outfits. Starting with a regular one-piece cotton dress, we see all the working women wearing. If you were to do a regular one-piece dress out of cotton for lower class impressions, let's add up the money. So we're not going to calculate the cost of chemise, drawers, corset, petticoats, any of that nature for this, because that would be basically the same for both the mismatched outfit and then the working class outfit, and I don't want to add that to this. So we're just going to do baseline. If you already have all the underpinnings to do the outerwear, what would it cost? For a one-piece dress, you will need 6 or 7 yards of 44-inch wide cotton fabric. There are plenty of places, if you look diligently, you can get reproduction cotton for less than $7 a yard. So let's say that's $55 plus shipping. And let's say you also bought a yard for a sunbonnet and then 2 yards for an apron. So that's basically $73 plus shipping, let's say $80. Now, if you went to Walmart and got some of their plaids, you can get it cheaper than the $6 a yard. My very first correctly made cotton dress, I got for $5 because I went to Goodwill, found a plaid cotton duvet cover in a period color and a period plaid, and my whole dress was $5. And that dress nearly lasted me 12 years. It is falling apart now, but it lasted me a really long time. So we're looking at $80 on the very high end of what you would get a working class garment. And let's say $20 or less if you're doing the thrift store route. So let's contrast that with the mismatched outfit. You are going to need 4 or 5 yards of either silk or wool to make that skirt, because those skirts were not in cotton unless it was a super sheer, very nice fabric. So I can get tropical weight wool for about $15 a yard, and most silks I can get for $22 a yard or less. And if they're on sale, sometimes I can get them for $12 a yard. Let's go with the low figure just to be fair. That's $60 just for the skirt. And we still have to face that skirt, although more typical it would be lined, but we'll just go facing again, just to be fair, do this the absolute cheapest we can do it. So that's another $21 in brown cotton, although if you really want to do it right, you really should get polished cotton, which is about $9 a yard, and that's now the bodice. We are going to need some very fine cotton. There will be nothing at Walmart, there will be nothing at Joann's that will work. You have to special order it. Let's do the cheap route and just go with cotton voile. That runs fairly cheaply, and it's still sheer enough where you can do one of these outfits. I mean, you could do cotton bobinette, that would be even better. You could do a window pane, which most likely run you about $12 to $15 a yard. But we're gonna go voile, so we're gonna say $16 without $4 of shipping, so we'll say $20 for the top. And we're just gonna make it plain, okay? No decoration, no velvet, no lace, no nothing. We're gonna make it plain. So that's $20 for the waist. You're gonna need a belt for this ensemble, either silk or a velvet belt, or you could do a matching corselet to the skirt. Let's go with a regular belt. Ensembles of the past has belt buckles for $40 and a belting ribbon for about $3 for a quarter of a yard. So let's just say your waist is, you're gonna need about a yard, so that's $12 for the belting ribbon. So that's $55 for the belt, including the shipping. And we really should have a nice collar and cuffs with this outfit. So let's go to Farmhouse Fabrics. We're gonna get a yard of Swiss edging, which comes out to be about $9, and then shipping, so we'll just say $12. You can't use the stuff from Walmart or Joann's. It is, first off, poly cotton. Secondly, not in period designs. It's not fine enough to be period. And yeah, lots of reasons why we can't just go use the stuff at Joann's or Walmart. Now, of course, we had to have a bonnet, and these can be very expensive. We'll go the cheap route. We'll do a $50 kit from Timely Tresses, and we'll still need to buy half a yard of silk with some trimmings. Danielle has silk for sale right now, so that'll be $7.50 for enough silk to do your bonnet. So that's excellent. Now, of course, we need trimmings, and that is where things can get very expensive. So let's do the very, very cheap route and just say $20 for that. So that's $77.50, and add maybe $15 for shipping. So we're at like $92.50. And because fashion bonnets don't shade our faces, we're going to need a parasol. I have not seen a $20 parasol on eBay for a very long time, but let's just say we can find one for $20. Most likely it's going to cost you about $100, but we're going to be extremely fair to the point of unrealism. But let's just say that we're going to need a yard of black silk taffeta to recover that, which is going to be $22 a yard, and we're also going to need some white or black China silk, which is $9 a yard to recover that. So let's say $38 total with shipping. And technically you need a fancy scalloper to edge your parasol with if you're going to do one of the cheap American marquee parasols. But I have, before I got my scalloper, done the $12.99 Amazon scalloped scrapbooking scissors, and those work. They're very finicky, and you have to do the scallops within the scallops, but it does work. So let's just say you're going to do the tedious work and save some money there. So let's add all of that up. That is over $300. And those are right now prices. Those are very cheap prices to the point of unrealistic, because really it would cost probably $400 to $500 to get this outfit if you didn't have any of the stash fabric, if you didn't already have a bonnet, if you didn't already have a parasol, any of that nature. So you could go get all the stuff right now, and that would be your price. So you would do, so basically it would be around $70 for your working outfit, including, you know, your bonnet, your apron and all that, or $300 to $400 for your fancy mismatched outfit. So I'm just gonna leave that there. And yes, there may be one or two women photographed with mismatched clothing, but again, we don't have the context, and therefore we can't use it as documentation or research until we have that context. Y'all know my general spiel about living history ratios and getting them as close as possible to the period ratios, and that's just something else I want to just gently put in here. I have a personal rule of thumb that if I see something weird, I need to find at least 3 of those weird things before I consider it to be more of a thing that may have been done. Case in point, unpiped arm size in the mid-19th century. I say at least 98% of original dresses I have ever seen in my life have had piping at the arm side or the armhole. And I've looked at, handled, viewed, or otherwise have studied literally over 1,000 original garments from this time period. And that's on the very low end of guesstimating. Maybe half a dozen to a dozen dresses with piping. I haven't counted up in a little bit. So definitely more than the contrast piping without the arm side piping, but still not very many. It's like a blip on that 1,000 or more dresses that I've seen. And I've noticed a few things about unpiped arm side dresses. About 50% of the homespun dresses I've seen did not have piped arm sides. Now I have seen only about 10 of those. That's not the greatest sample size, but 50% is still a decent number. A lot of them did have piping though still. Another interesting thing to note is that both of the dresses I've examined pre-1860 from my county, my home county, both had unpiped arm sides. They actually were almost identical. One was a silk wool blend and one was a homespun. And it's interesting to me because they had the both exact same design. I mean, it was bishop sleeves, gathered bodice with a waistband. The waistband was piped. The neckline was piped. Both of them had buttons down the front. They had gauge skirts. Basically the exact same dress, but one was a very nice wool silk blend and one was a very low class, homespun dress. Neither one of them had piping. And so now I'm thinking in the back of my head, okay, was no piping in the arm side like a local thing that they did? Because both dresses I have seen did not have piping. Now I have post 1865 dresses from my county that did have piping, but not pre. Is this a coincidence? Because there's only two. Or is it an actual thing that it may have happened in this one local area? I don't have a big enough sample size to say one way or the other. The way I think about it is once is weird, twice is a coincidence, 3 is the beginning of a pattern. And more than 3 times is a pattern worth documenting. Now I still make all my dresses with piping because 2 is not a big enough sample size to say one way or the other. So I do caution people who find evidence of one, the one weird photograph that no one can really explain. Yes, weird things out of the norm did happen. That doesn't mean we need to parade it around and get other people to do the same thing, especially when we're presenting ourselves to the public for the purpose of education. The exception would be, of course, if you're portraying a real person that we know did this weird thing. For example, if I was doing an 1870s event in Hempstead, Texas, we would probably choose to have someone portray Elizabeth Ney, who lived in the area. She was a famous German sculptor. She was a local celebrity in the sense that she was really well known in Texas for being very good at her job. And it'd be cool to have someone portray her. Now, she had short hair. She typically wore pants. She lived with a man she didn't appear to be married to. And had 2 kids with him, actually. So for 1870s Bible Belt, Texas, this would be very weird. Planning this hypothetical event, I could have her, but I would have to make sure everyone else was as straight-laced as possible and everything was documented and everything was correct and normal for the time period to further set apart how weird this lady was, to not give anyone else the idea that this was a little bit more normal. No, we need to show that she was extremely strange. Everyone else over here is doing basically the same thing. We have her over here doing her thing. And that's not to say that we shouldn't portray the weird people. We just need to use those impressions to subtly educate the public on what was the norm and what was not the norm through other people in the town. And that's my 2 cents on the subject. We'll continue with our myth. So a common excuse I come across for mixing and matching is, well, if a woman only had enough fabric for a skirt or a top, she wouldn't have wasted it. She would have just made it up and only worn the pieces that she had. And this is a very flawed way of thinking and not understanding on how the 19th century worked at all. It's not like today where oftentimes sewers have vast amounts of stashed fabric. No, you went to the store and you bought a length of fabric knowing that you were going to make a dress. You bought a dress length. If the store didn't have enough fabric to make a whole dress, they wouldn't have shown you that if you asked for dress fabric. So once a shop sold out of its adult dresses, or adult dress lengths, because they weren't selling real dresses, of course they were selling the dress lengths, but it had some bits left over, what was it going to do? That's when remnants would be sold for children's clothes and other such, crafting materials. So let's see what the 1860s, the Mother's Thorough Research book, has to say on the subject. Quote, "It should be known that every shop which supplies the materials for wearing apparel has what is termed remnants to dispose of. These consist of cotton, linen, print, silk, satin, and every kind of fabric of various lengths, colors, patterns, etc. Generally speaking, the shopkeeper is only too glad to get rid of these odds and ends, and he offers them at such a price as to render them bargains in reality. Now, supposing mother is about to make a dress for her little girl, let her into the linen draper's shop, and after purchasing some trifling article, put the question, 'Have you any remnants for children's dresses?' The answer will no doubt be the affirmative, and the variety of remnants will be shown to the mother from which she may make her selection, end quote. In The Deserted Wife of 1850, a character laments only having a son and wanting a daughter to dress in finery, as her son takes after his father and considers himself too old to be dressed up. Quote, I never go into a dry goods store and see remnants of pretty calico or merino, but I think what sweet frocks for a little girl they would make, end quote. The Wesleyan Methodist Magazine of 1851 mentions briefly that there are several poor children in the mission field, and if those at home could forward remnants of print for children's clothing, that would be very useful for them. And let us not forget the story of Lydia Leeson from Godey's Ladies Book in the 1840s. We recounted Lydia's story in detail in my Dressmakers podcast, and also in the last myth-busting video. But very briefly, Lydia was a poor doctor's daughter who saved herself money to buy a silk gown. When the dress came back from the dressmakers, Lydia's silk dress was far too small. There was no extra to let out, and no excess fabric was sent with the dress. So there was no way she could wear the dress. Now, fabric-wise, Lydia could have easily taken that bodice and cut herself a larger waistband, reset the waist, and had herself a silk skirt to wear with another bodice. So why didn't she? Why instead did she save that dress until she had a good friend who was much smaller framed than her and could wear the dress without issue? And that's because wearing mismatched outfits was not the norm and generally acceptable in her time period. This is the 1840s. We don't have that white blouse and skirt combo that we see in the 1860s yet. So she made use of fabric, and because she didn't have children to cut down the dress for, she saved it for another use. She saved it for friends. Therefore, the only period option she had was to do what she did. Give it to someone else. And all that to say, but no, if they didn't have enough fabric for a full dress, they would have just made what they had and mix and matched. It's not solid research. It's nothing but fanciful conjecture from people who have made up their mind, who do not understand nor seek to understand 19th century society and life. It is a very 20th century ideal, and then is applied to earlier centuries because we now see this as wise thriftiness, although the 19th century person would have considered it absurd. So our last myth will be about solid colored cottons being used for dresses. After all, you see so many solid fabrics in original photographs, and not everyone could afford the silks and wools, right? We'll have to leave the afford part for another day. Even Lydia was an example of how poor people could afford a silk dress if they truly desired it. But logically, there should be solid colored cotton dresses, right? And logically, yeah, you would think so. However, when you look at the vast amount of original dresses that we have that have survived, you don't see solid colored cotton dresses in the mid-19th century. But then people cry, well, what about this original? It's cotton in a solid color. And again, research levels and not understanding the context is its own video that I already have out. And I'm going to attempt not to go off on a tangent to answer this question, although I kind of already sort of have gone off on tangents. So instead of desperately trying to find the one or two examples or what seem to be examples of what you want, the process should include more critical thinking. Starting, of course, with the source. Was it an eBay listing saying this is a cotton dress? Do we really trust a random person on eBay who may or may not have ever handled an extant dress before to be able to tell the difference between a period wool and a cotton just by feel on the first time they've ever felt a mid-19th century dress? They're probably not the most reliable of source. Now, they could know what they're talking about. They also could not. I can't tell you how many 19th century regular adult size umbrellas I have bought with people calling them child's umbrellas. Mid-19th century parasols are very small, about 18 inches in diameter, usually 18 to like 21 inches in diameter. Yeah, they can be tiny, so everyone assumes they're child parasols unless you actually know what you're talking about. Again, other random things that people have no idea what they are. Now, granted, as a collector, I don't mind the people who don't know what things are, because that's how I get, the original 1855 coverlet for $15 and things like that. But then there are people who are using these ads and these listings as proof that things happened. The problem is that when you add up the amount of people who have come into contact with original dresses, there are unfortunately only a few number of people on the planet who have studied period fabrics. And that means the vast majority of people coming in contact with these originals have not studied the context and have not studied the time period of this garment. And so they are using their 21st century mindset to identify the fibers in this 19th century gown. And the 19th century was a long time ago. Things have changed. 19th century period dress weight wools are soft, light, airy, and smooth. They are nothing like the stiff and scratchy thick wools that we typically see today. And so the unsuspecting person would never expect a period wool to feel like a period wool. You feel it and you think it's cotton. I can speak from experience. They feel like cotton. Until you get it under a microscope, you can often not tell whether it's a wool or a cotton. And it's certainly not these people's fault, But there are a lot of amateur researchers who need to realize this and not take people's word as gospel when it comes to fiber content of original dresses. And museums are not immune to this either, unfortunately. And there are a lot of reasons that museums get confused on this subject, because someone with an advanced degree in history or even textile history and works at a world-renowned museum doesn't know the specific details of every single time period within all of history, even within something as niche as textile history. And sometimes family lore is written up as fact, sometimes it's an uneducated intern writing down descriptions, and sometimes it's not well-versed curators. But museums make mistakes too. I mean, I worked for a museum that had some very clearly 1880s to 1890s shoes labeled as 1850 just because they came out of a trunk that was a wedding trunk of a lady who got married in 1850. So obviously everything that we found in the trunk had to date to 1850. It's not like she could have lived into the 19-teens, bought things and just stored them in a trunk she got when she married in 1850. So yeah, you can't take museums' word for it all the time. They do their best, and the small museums are often the most enthusiastic about sharing their collections, and let's be honest, they have the coolest stuff. But small museums are also, unfortunately, don't have the time, money, personnel, or resources to know everything, and so they rely a lot on the family lore, which is most often going to be correct and is mildly unstable at best. Let's take a few examples from the Met. This one is touted as being cotton, and even though it is not made up as a cotton, in the mid-19th century, it would be highly unusual to see a cotton dress being trimmed in anything other than self fabric, which is why there's a lot of researchers who believe this is actually a wool, or at least a wool-cotton blend. Now, to my knowledge, the Met has actually confirmed that this is not a solid. It is actually a very fine pink and white stripe. So it's not even a solid, even if it is a cotton, it's still not a solid. So that debunks that right there. They won't get it under a microscope to see if it's actually wool or cotton or not, but it's still not a solid, so you can't use this as documentation for solid color cotton dresses. And now this one's also from the Met. It's a sack and petticoat, which appears to be solid and is listed as cotton. Now, I told you earlier we would discuss sacks and petticoats, so I'll do that now. Sacks and petticoats really fell into two categories. One was a form of undress, which is very similar to a wrapper, something you'd wear at home and only at home and not generally be seen in. And the other version is a traveling or a recreational outfit. So for traveling, it's usually of some dust-colored linen or wool, and for recreation, it's of some sturdy fabric and sometimes trimmed. And these are specifically, I don't want to say high-class garments, but you have to think about the types of people who are doing recreational activities such as hiking for fun or croquet once that came to America in 1864. I believe the sack and petticoat likely falls into the undress at home category. It's a very fine fabric. I cannot accurately discern from the photograph whether it's wool or cotton. My gut says wool because not only does it appear to be solid, but it's also trimmed with an unmatching ribbon, which does to me say wool. This one is later, post-American Civil War. I'd bet money on this that it is wool and not cotton like the Met has it labeled. And how much does period wool feel like cotton? Well, some period wools can be so fine that they trick even the most knowledgeable folks. Now, I don't actually call myself the most knowledgeable folks. Yeah, some of them can only be discerned by a microscope. I myself have been fooled on many wools that even by feel I could have sworn were cotton. Case in point, I recently purchased a 1860s child's dress and sack coat. And from the way it was braided and the photographs, I could tell it was wool because it was made up as a wool. And I didn't question my first thought of, hey, this is a wool, until I got my hands on it. And I did a double take because it had to be cotton. It felt exactly like cotton. There's no way that could be wool. So my hands were telling me something different than my brain was telling me, so I had to get out the trusty dusty microscope and look it under, and surprise, surprise, it's a wool. So yeah, I've handled plenty of period wools before, and tons of them, and I'd say maybe not tons, like 100, give or take, I have personally handled and felt. I've seen all manner of original wool examples, and this one still tripped me up. So don't feel bad if you've fallen for the wools described as cotton, because yeah, I think we all have at some point. Now, the particular wool from my child's outfit would lay exactly like this purple sack, because a lot of people say that, oh, it drapes like cotton, so it has to be cotton. I'm telling you, this little child's thing, it feels like a cotton, it drapes like a cotton, but it's wool, it's not cotton. And so yes, I do agree that both garments do drape a lot more like a cotton than a wool. I'm assuming it's still probably a wool, but again, we don't know because the Met hasn't got it under a microscope. Or it could be a blend. I mean, you could get cheap wools, which are often just a wool-cotton blend, so that is a possibility. And so why don't we see solid color cotton on dresses? They had solid cottons. We see them in quilts, and we see them mentioned in store ledgers or in swatch books, but why weren't they used for dresses? So in 1845's an Encyclopedia of Domestic Economy doesn't really tell us why, but it does in plain print explain this phenomenon. So in Chapter 12 on calico printing, quote, "Cotton cloths are seldom dyed of one uniform color, except for linings, but when used in dresses for the female sex, drapery of beds and windows, the coverings of furniture, and similar purposes, they are ornamented with figures of various kinds, printed in colors, and the endless variety of patterns which are printed on white cotton and muslin give to these fabrics a rich and elegant effect," end quote. So even in the period, they are telling us that cotton cloths are only very rarely dyed solid colors except for linings. Linings are usually brown cotton, but even polished cotton could come in other colors. I have seen it in white, brown, blue, green. Did I say black already? I've seen it in those colors. It may come in other colors, but those are the ones I've personally seen. So let's speculate further onto why cottons don't show up in solid colors. Well, I actually have lovely photographic evidence as to why. This is a reproduction cotton dress that was incorrectly made into solid cotton. It looks nice, right? Well, let's pull the skirt open. And there it is. That is one reason why. If that were a print, plaid, or stripe, the pattern would disguise the fading more than the solid. And this was a new, like a modern dyed cotton. This isn't natural dyes, which fade a lot more unevenly. This is the fancy new synthetic dyes. Natural dyes on cotton would fade even more. And yes, prints disguise that fact. They distract your eye from the fading so you don't notice the fading as much. Which leads me to another point. Were cottons ever dyed solid for dresses? Well, kind of. I have seen some very fine light colored cottons that could be cotton organdy, like the seller suggested, or they could be a silk organza, in which case the solid would be not unusual. It's basically the same fabric in different fibers. And these things were used for very fine evening gowns, sheer gowns, and there were some goatees in other ladies' magazines that allude to pink or blue fine cotton for evening dresses, but there's no picture accompanying them, and so you have to think, is this a solid color? Is it just a pattern with a predominant color of pink or blue? Is it even something as simple as a woven design, such as a window pane, but still technically an overall solid color? And there are also some very fine and solid sheer day dresses out there, although again, these are almost always have some sort of woven design, such as a window pane, plaid, or something of that nature. And that makes sense with what we discussed above. A window pane would distract from any potential sheer dresses and evening dresses that were not meant to last more than a season or two. They were the 19th century version of fast fashion. A lot of these sheers just didn't hold up to general wear, and so you could only wear them for a little bit. And I have not personally come across any references to sheer dresses being remade or refitted. They are generally just discarded after they show signs of wear. And so they probably aren't going to fade, and if they do, even a window pane is going to distract slightly, especially because it's sheer and it's therefore see-through, so you can always say with the petticoat underneath, oh, is that really fading, or is it just, petticoat? So you can get away with it a little bit more in that sheer category, I think, than you could with like a solid colored, opaque cotton. But because I have not had my hands on any plain solid cottons, I would stick to window panes and dimity plaids and solids and just make sure they're super fine and very sheer to be correct, but that's the only way I'd ever recommend doing a solid cotton. But for anything that's not super sheer and fancy, solid cotton should not be used. But what about over dyeing? So there are dye manuals all over the 19th century about how to over dye faded dresses and bonnets, or whatever the article of clothing may be. So surely they would be solid after over dyeing. Well, you'd be surprised to find out that unless you're dyeing an extremely dark shade like black, the pattern of the original fabric will almost always shine through, even with over dyeing. And so let's remember my first natural dyeing podcast, we learned that cotton fabrics, being plant-based or cellulose fibers, do not take vibrant dyes as well as protein fibers like silk and wool. So a dark color that would really truly over dye a cotton would be rather difficult to achieve with the cotton. So yes, the print will almost always shine through. And with that being said, I will not bore my audience again with my favorite trope of ratios at living history events. But let's just say that if only 1,000 dresses of the, let's say 10,000 original dresses survive to us today, and of that 1,000 dresses, only 2 examples were solid color cotton, and we have 20 reenactresses at an event, would having any woman at that event in a solid color cotton fit within the period ratios? Let's leave it at that outside of a very, very sheer and fine cotton fabric, cotton should be of a period print, plaid, or stripe, not a solid. Now for our third myth, which I don't think warrants a lot of time, which is great because I think we've been filming for a hot minute, and I do try to keep these under 45 minutes. We do need to talk about 19th century homespun and the so-called homespun that you can buy at Hobby Lobby and Walmart. And to preface this, I have only seen the details of about 15 mid-19th century homespun samples, and only 7 of those have been in person. The rest have been online and pictures. So that's not the greatest of sample size, and I'll be the first to say that perhaps there are other versions of homespun that maybe do mesh with the modern stuff a little bit better than the stuff that I have personally examined. But with the sample size I have seen, I see some glaringly differences between the period homespun, which by the way could refer to a variety of cloth from those made in factory just in your local area that's still considered homespun. It could refer to cloth that was woven at home but with bought yarn, or it could be something that was spun and woven at home. So Annette Jordanson has an excellent article and a recorded lecture on period references to homespun in the American Civil War era, which I will link below. But to get into the differences and why I caution the use of the modern old-timey crappy fabric, as I like to call it. First, the threads in the modern stuff are going to be much thinner than I have seen in any extant homespun. In addition to this, the thread count is always super low, which means there's gaps between all the fibers, which I don't see with period homespun. I see a very dense fabric that's very tightly woven with little space between the rows. And this space causes the modern stuff to shrink horribly, and which you must take into account when buying fabric because it shrinks quite a bit. You're going to need to buy at least 15 to 20% extra fabric to account for shrinkage in that particular fabric. Another problem I have with modern homespun is the two-tone colors, especially more in the Hobby Lobby and Joann's and Walmart stuff. There are online versions that have 3 or more colors in them, and sometimes even more. But that's not what I see living historians go with. I see them go with the two-tone, the tan and the color, whether that be red or blue or orange or something. They tend to go with tan and then a color. Almost all of the original plaid homespuns I've ever seen had at least 3, but usually 4 colors in them. I have seen 1 plaid and a few striped originals that had 2 colors, but the plaid one was a very decorative weave, which we don't see in the modern approximation. It's very plain weave. And in the 3 to 4 original colors I'm speaking of on most homespuns, white is considered to be a color. As in blue, white, and orange is considered 3 colors in my opinion, even though that's not necessarily the period way of saying it, because a lot of times white isn't considered a color. A 4th issue I have with modern fabric is that, and this one's hard to describe, but it's the very even looking plaid patterns that you see on modern homespuns. They don't just seem to appear in the original examples. They are some of the most uneven with colors, with the different shades not being the same with the cross, and there being different amounts of threads in each color. And also, this is the one that most irritates me, but modern homespun fabrics have this feature where it's tan plus a color, like we already talked about. And that's because tan looks old-timey and white looks too new. But bright white appears in almost all original homespuns I've seen. And in some cases when the fabric has yellowed over time, you can tell it used to be white. But I've never seen that modern homespun tan. I have seen butternut orange, yes. I have seen a light bright tan, yes. I've seen a medium brown or a dark brown. But that very particular dull tea-dye tan I have not seen or come across in period homespun. And I'm not entirely sure or convinced that that shade existed within homespun fabrics. And again, hasn't just been created through yellowing and age with the originals. And that dull tan is just about in every modern homespun, because again, it makes the fabric look old. And I've also been victim of using modern homespun before I actually really got my hands on a lot of original homespun, and I realized how wrong it actually is. So this is absolutely not me trying to shame anyone who has used this. This is education, because I've made these mistakes too, and so therefore I want to help other people get educated and to not make the mistakes, or replace those garments that they have made those mistakes on, and hopefully refrain from making those mistakes if you're new to this type of thing. So in short, modern fake homespun is too thin, not dense enough, doesn't typically have the right amount of colors, are woven in patterns that do not align with the mid-19th century original homespuns, have too much tan in general and not enough white, and are artificially aged. And for those reasons, I do not recommend that fabric. And so that just about wraps up today's video on dress myths of the 19th century. Have you heard any of these myths? Are there myths that you didn't even cross your mind? You're interested and you're surprised to find out that, oh, that actually doesn't work. And let me know in the comments what you found most surprising. If you stuck around to the very end of this video, thank you so much for doing so. Again, I know these kind of get long, but hopefully you learned some things in the process. And with all that being said, thank you so much for joining me today and indulging me into dispelling some Victorian dress myths. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel. Click that little bell notification so you're notified anytime I upload a new video. And as always, have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the next video.